Mr. Moderator and fellow town meeting members, my name is Rick Simbone, and I'm a town meeting member from Precinct H and a member of the Community Preservation Committee. I'm appearing here before you to present for your consideration Article 32, which seeks town meeting's approval to appropriate the estimated fiscal year 2022 Community Preservation Fund revenues and allocate them pursuant to the requirements of the Community Preservation Act. A summary of this article is provided in your warrant. At this time, I'm going to share my screen and present a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, that we can use for the purposes of performing or going through the presentation. So before discussing the article in detail, let me provide some background. The Community Preservation Committee is responsible for the implementation of the town's Community Preservation Plan, pursuant to the requirements of the Community Preservation Act, also known as the CPA. The CPA is a funding mechanism for cities and towns to award grants to applicants to support community housing, the preservation of historic resources, the acquisition and preservation of open space, and the restoration and investment in recreational resources. There are two funding sources of the Community Preservation Act. The first source of funds comes from property tax surcharge receipts. Needham adopted the Community Preservation Act in 2004. As adopted, Needham residents are billed a 2% annual surcharge on property taxes after the first $100,000 of valuation. In fiscal year 2022, it is estimated that Needham will receive just under $3 million in property tax surcharges dedicated to the CPA. The second source of funds is the Commonwealth's Community Preservation Fund. As a participating town, Needham receives a distribution from the Massachusetts Community Preservation Trust Fund. The Community Preservation Trust Fund has a complex distribution formula based on the number of communities participating and their respective local surcharges. The Commonwealth has informed the town that the estimated CPA match for fiscal year 2022 will be 17.7% of last year's qualifying surcharge property tax. Consequently, the state CPA Trust Fund distribution for fiscal year 2022 is estimated at just over $500,000. Combining these two sources of revenue, the estimated fiscal year 2022 Community Preservation Fund revenues total just under $3.5 million. The Community Preservation Act mandates that annually at least 10% of the property tax surcharges plus state distribution funds be spent on actual projects or be allocated for future projects in three specific CPA reserves: community housing, open space, and historical resources. The remainder of the funds, minus funds allocated for administrative expenses, is placed in an annual reserve fund, which can only be used for projects in these three areas and/or for qualifying recreational projects. In prior years, or historically, the Needham Community Preservation Committee has elected to appropriate 11% of the estimated receipts for each special reserve category to ensure that the town stays compliant with the mandate. Using this formula, the required reserves estimated this year would be $382,391. for each of the community housing, historic resource reserve, and open space buckets, with the caveat that the required annual appropriation for historic reserve is part of the payment of the debt service on the town hall historic renovation, which town meeting approved as part of the budget article earlier in this special town meeting. This year, the CPC has elected to appropriate 22% of the estimated receipts for community housing reserve, or $764,783. Let me explain why the Community Preservation Committee has elected to make this increased appropriation. And I will do that by beginning with an analysis of the historical source of funding for our projects. And if you take a look at the funding process on this chart, you can see that over the years, we've approved as town meeting 59%, or approximately 59% of all of the funds distributed or to be distributed to the open space, including recreation bucket. Historic renovation is approximately 37%. Both of those numbers include the future-looking debt service for the historic town hall and for the Rosary Pool recreation. The housing bucket for community housing has only received roughly 4% of our expenditures over time, or $1.75 million out of a total projected of $42 million. Let me just talk a minute before I delve into it a little bit more deeply. The approval process that we've historically used for funding CPA projects. First of all, we take the applications process, or applications received, and we process them annually. Projects are first reviewed by the committee to determine eligibility for CPA funding. We then complete due diligence and analyze each project to determine not only the current funding needs, but request for funds needed to complete the project, for example, design and then construction. Based on this analysis and due diligence, we would either partially fund projects, and in that case, seek funds from alternative sources, or fully fund up to the amount requested by the applicant. Moving forward, we've taken into consideration the past expenditures of funds for CPA projects. We've also taken a look at some of the commitments or projects identified for future commitments as we move out through time. At this point, particularly in light of the fact that we have some major projects on the horizon, we decided that we needed to shift our focus from allocating 11% to something greater, particularly in one of the housing buckets, in the housing bucket where it's going to be needed the most. If we look out, we identify and project our capital needs, we find that the current financial model indicates that we have more funding needs than resources available. So part of the process that we went through this year is to start the process of identifying priorities and earmarking funds for our additional needs. And I'll get into that a little bit more detail here. The projects identified with dollar estimates for, not counting this year, but over the next 3 to 4 years, are listed below. Some of them are fairly sizable. For example, sediment removal from the town reservoir, which is estimated at $2 million. We just approved the estimate for the design funds this year to determine how best to go about that. In addition, there are field renovations of over $1 million for lights at Cox and field renovations at Coxman Field. We have public playgrounds for approximately $275,000. The second phase of the Walker Pond project that will be the subject of one of the articles at town meeting. Renovation of the cricket field building for almost $1.2 million. Work on the Broadmeadow and Elliott Fields of approximately $1.2 million. And other miscellaneous small projects that you see over the course of the year. If you notice, most of these projects are related to open space and recreation. Taking a look at some of the other projects that are anticipated over that 3 to 4 year period where we do not have an estimate or and is yet undefined dollar amount. In some cases, we do have estimates, but let me just talk about those for a second. One of which is the Emery Grover construction bond payments. That could range anywhere, the request for that could range anywhere from $6 million to $12 million against CPA funding. Another example is projects that are proposed, will be proposed by the Needham Housing Authority. I'll describe those in greater detail, but those projects could require approximately $5 million of CPA funds. There's also projects that could develop out of the activities of the Needham Housing Trust. There are also other projects in the open space and recreation area, such as the Asa Small field renovation, the Rosemary Boat Launch construction, a DeFazio Complex walking path, Perry Park upgrades, High Rock field improvements, and as always, our annual estimated parcel acquisition. Why specifically are we looking to increase the earmarking of funds for the Community Housing Reserve? Well, first of all, we have potential users out there, one of which is the Needham Housing Authority. Needham Housing Authority owns and manages approximately 300 plus units in federal and state subsidized affordable housing. Their mission is to provide safe and affordable housing for low to moderate income families and for individuals. In 2020, the CPA funded $150,000 for a consultant to identify and procure future funding to implement the Needham Housing Authority's 2019 Affordable Housing Plan. In that Affordable Housing Plan, a number of projects were identified, far exceeding $5 million. What the $5 million would be for is that would provide the seed money for the town's commitment to move forward with funding through the federal and state funding agencies for at least 3 major projects. One would be the construction of new elderly apartments in the Captain Robert Cook Seabed Way area. A second would be for the redevelopment of the homes in the High Rock Estates. And third, for the redevelopment of the homes in the Linden Chambers area. All of these projects would require a commitment by the town moving forward, so that once those sources are identified, we need to have the money earmarked and readily available for partnership with the federal and state agencies. And that's why we're specifically earmarking the money for the Community Housing Reserve. Second possibility is through the Needham Affordable Housing Trust. That trust, the Housing Trust, was created by town meeting in 2017. Its objective or mission is to provide for the preservation and creation of affordable housing for low and moderate income residents. Last fall, town meeting approved the rental assistance program. In that instance, we provided rental assistance for those renters in town who were negatively impacted as a result of the COVID pandemic, who perhaps lost their job or weren't able to meet their obligations, their rental obligations. Possible sources of future CPA funding. We had a meeting with a couple of the members of the Housing Trust as well as the staff to identify some possible uses for that fund. Now it's currently undefined, but for example, there's possibility of a partnership to develop some subsidized elderly or low-income rental units, or also possibly to buy down or provide buy down assistance, such as down payment or closing costs for affordable housing. You say, where do these ideas come from? Well, they come from what other towns are doing. If you take a look at some towns of comparable size to Needham, you take a look at Belmont, for example, who's set aside funds for the Belmont Housing Trust so that they can act expeditiously on emerging opportunities that fit within the CPA guidelines. In the case of Concord, they have the Community Housing Reserve Fund, and similar to WISE, that they're putting funds in that reserve for future community housing projects, just like we're proposing here. They're also already funding contribution for the construction of an 83-unit, fully affordable assisted living facility. In Lexington, they've allocated funds for the development of community housing on one of their sites. Additionally, they've allocated funds to preserve, rehabilitate, and restore some of the Lexington House Assistance Board units. Further, you take a look at Suburbs. They've allocated funds for the acquisition or creation of community housing in their community housing reserve. Cambridge, which allocates a significant amount of money to community housing, has allocated funds to acquire a site for development of affordable housing, to create 23 new affordable rental units, and to provide financing for eligible first-time homebuyers. Duxbury has funded the Affordable Housing Trust to be used for first-time home ownership assistance programs. They funded subsidies for the development, design, construction, and marketing for low or moderate income housing. And they've also funded to restore or preserve some elderly or disabled housing in the town. If you take a look at the reserves that are available now, the beginning balances in the community housing reserve is just under $2.5 million. With the recommended reserve allocation of $765,000 for fiscal year 2022, it would bring the total reserve in the community housing bucket to $3.2 million, well short of the $5 million that would be needed to subsidize or help fund the Needham Housing Authority endeavors going out through town. And also, if there were further requests from the Needham Affordable Housing Trust, we would be short money. So this is the beginning of a down payment that we would have to increase the allocation of reserve funds earmarked specifically for community housing. We still have money available in the open space reserve and in the general reserve to continue to do the projects that are currently on the books and headed out into the future. So, in summary, referring to your warrant article, you will note that the recommended appropriation for the estimated fiscal year 2022 CPA receipts, these appropriations total just under 2.5 million for the general reserve, the housing reserve, the historic reserve, and the open space recreation reserve. In addition, there's $82,000 for administrative costs and approximately a little more than $1 million that's been approved in the town's budget article to fund the debt service requirements for the historic renovation of Town Hall and for the construction of the Rosemary Recreational Complex, bringing the total expenses and revenues to just under 3.5 million, matching the CPA revenues that we earmarked and described previously. So with that, let me conclude by asking the town meeting members for their approval for Article 32 and the recommended allocation for the community reserve funds as described in your warrant article. With that, I thank you. And I wish you all a safe and happy weekend.